Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Saddleback webinar. My name is Liz Mangus, Literacy Specialist with Saddleback Educational Publishing. And as usual, we have hopped on just a few minutes early. I love that many of you know by now that we always hop on early, so you're here with us. The reason we do this is because we want you to be familiar with locating your control bar, and that is where your chat and your Q&A icons are. Those two icons are important because that's how you're going to communicate with us today. So the chat feature, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with because we are living in a Zoom world now, but please use the chat feature to communicate with your fellow attendees and our presenter and Saddleback today. Just be sure that in the little drop-down menu there that you select all panelists and attendees. That way everybody can see what it is you're trying to share. Otherwise, only I will see it and a few other people, and that's not as much fun. So please be sure that you select all panelists and attendees so everybody can hear your thoughts. The Q&A area today is going to be the place where you can put your questions. And those are questions for either Saddleback or for our presenter today. I know sometimes we get those questions and we put them in the chat area, and that's fine too. But just be aware it might take us a little bit longer to get to those questions if you put them in the chat area. One final word about the chat. The chat area is where we will eventually today be providing you with a handout from today's session. Just please be aware that the handout for today's session will come a little bit later on in our webinar. I know many of you who join us on a regular basis, you're used to getting your handouts right away. But today, because of the nature of our topic and our session, we're going to provide those handouts a little bit later on. So stay tuned. And when we do that, we will put a link in the chat area for you. All right. And of course, here is your weekly reminder from our webinars to follow us on Twitter. The Twitter information you need is right here, both for Saddleback and for Dr. Barbara Kennedy, who is our presenter today. So go ahead, let everybody know that you're joining us for this fantastic opportunity today, and connect with us and follow us on Twitter. Speaking of Dr. Barbara Kennedy, otherwise known as BK, she's here. Hello, BK, how are you?
I am so good. Thank you so much, Liz. It's great to be here today. I'm so excited to meet with this group.
We have, I already see the chat lighting up. We have a lot of people joining us. We have people joining us internationally from Ecuador. We have Texas and Chicago, Round Rock, that's where I am. Welcome everybody. And I love that you're so enthusiastic that you're jumping on early to be with us. But as they say, the early bird gets the worm. So because you're here early, you are going to get a sneak peek of what we're going to be doing today, which is a little bit different. We're doing a simulated lesson, and we're doing a virtual fishbowl activity. Isn't that right, BK?
Absolutely.
So something that's going to happen that's different today is we are going to invite you to participate and allow a handful of volunteers to unmute their microphones to participate in the lesson today. So if you feel like you want to volunteer and potentially get chosen to turn on your microphone, you can let us know right now by raising your hand. And right before the lesson starts, I will prompt you again to raise your hand, and we will go ahead and just randomly select a few people to unmute so you can take part in the lesson. And you will know you've been selected because you'll get a little notification prompting you to unmute your microphone. So I'm super excited about this because we love having you and we love sharing information with you, but it's even better when we can bring you in and have you participate with us. So yeah, so we're looking forward to that. We already have a few volunteers, which is great. So,
and Liz, may I also just add that even if you are not going to be unmuted during our lesson a little bit later today, we really, really encourage you to actively participate even though you're muted. Okay, so the whole point is to be as interactive as possible. That's how we can make this experience really come to life. So whether you're muted or unmuted, I think we're all going to be actively participating.
thank you for saying that. That's a very key detail. Just because you might be muted doesn't mean that you cannot participate. So, and I'm really excited about this. So thank you to BK, and thank you for all of you joining us early today. Let's go ahead and officially introduce you to our presenter today. So with us, we have Dr. Barbara Kennedy, otherwise known as BK, and she is the co-author of The Guiding Principles for Dual Language Education, third edition, that came out in 2018. And she's the founder of Global Lingo Education Consulting. She's a multilingual educator and advocate for equity with over 30 years of experience. She has served as a teacher of world languages and bilingual education, a district administrator, a state director, and a national consultant. She's fluent in English, German, and Spanish, and she has conducted research on the bilingual teacher shortage in the United States K-12 schools. She devotes her everyday energies to supporting language educators in equity-focused program design, redesign, and evaluation, as well as through professional development, which she is providing for us here today. So welcome, BK. Thank you so very much. It looks like we are right on time to get started. I'm going to let you go ahead and share your screen, and I'm going to hang back here just for a few minutes until we get that lesson started.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pull up my presentation so that hopefully everyone can see it. Is it visible now to everybody?
Yes, we can see it.
Very good. And the sound is good?
Sound is good.
Awesome. So we're ready to begin then. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much to Saddleback for having me here and to Liz for that kind introduction. I'm so excited to be here today. We're going to be talking about bringing language and content to life in your virtual classroom. And everything that we talk about and explore today is, of course, also very applicable to a face-to-face classroom. So looking toward that light at the end of our COVID-19 tunnel to times when we can actually meet face-to-face with our students and with one another. We're going to do all of this through a simulated science lesson in German. And I hope that everyone here is excited about learning in a language that most of us probably are not proficient in. There may be a few of us here who are proficient in German. That's going to make this a little bit different. But the whole idea is to really get the feeling of what it's like to be a language learner, learning content and language simultaneously through integrated content and language, and what that experience is like, and then also what is critical in terms of teaching strategies and learning strategies to make all of that experience a success. So I think it's going to be great. Let's look at our objectives real quick. First, all of us, whether we are muted or unmuted today, are going to actively participate in this simulated science lesson that I'll be delivering in German. And as Liz mentioned earlier, but in case some of you are just joining us now, we ask that you raise your hand using the hand raising function if you're interested in participating, being unmuted and actively participating in an unmuted fashion. So go ahead and indicate that if you'd like. And then they'll be selecting randomly a few of you to participate like that. But the rest of us, we will all be participating even if we're muted. That being said, we'll also then identify teacher techniques and language learner strategies that we experience together and that together form an effective and productive teaching learning partnership. So we're going to be looking at this not just from the teacher's perspective, but also from the language learner perspective, which I hope is exciting and new for each and every one of you. So that being said, we're getting ready to begin our lesson, but what I'd like to do is give you a few pointers on how to best benefit from the lesson. So during this lesson, everybody, I'm going to ask that everybody participate actively. Please don't worry about taking notes. As Liz mentioned earlier, you're going to get a link to a handout with a lot of information on it a little later on, but we really want to focus on this experience first, okay? So we're going to go through the experience together. And what active participation looks like is I'm going to ask that you listen and repeat. So you'll see me, you should be able to see me on your screen, and I'll be using some gestures to help you understand. And when I ask you to listen, I'll be like this. I'll be like zuhören, zuhören, right? Because sometimes you're going to need to just listen and hear things modeled to you. But I also will be asking you to repeat. I'll say alle, 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 and then I'm asking you to repeat, right? So zuhören, zuhören, you'll be silent, and then alle, alle, you'll repeat, so that you can get some practice in orally. If I'm doing gestures, I ask that you mimic those gestures. I'm going to try to do them up in the screen. It's a little weird, but do it up where you can see it in front of the camera. Mimic those gestures, critical to have fun during this. And while it's all happening, don't take notes, but do kind of have that awareness of two things. Have your awareness of the teacher techniques that you're observing that are really helping you understand the lesson, okay? And at the same time, have an awareness of the strategies that you are using as a learner to be successful, okay? So you're paying attention to these two things. Afterwards, we'll have time for you to share them out and to discuss, okay? But your first and foremost goal here is to just actively participate, have fun, and do all that this lesson requires. So with that, Liz.
Okay, great. We already have a few volunteers with their hands raised. Last call, if you want to volunteer to possibly be unmuted, we're going to select a few people at random. If you would like to volunteer to be unmuted to participate, please go ahead and raise your hand right now. We'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, I see those numbers going up. And we'll go ahead and we'll start choosing a few of you at random. You'll get a notification and you'll be able to unmute and participate. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Looks like we've got a few people. Okay, great. All right. Well, I will go ahead and mute myself and turn off the camera. We can see our participants joining us now to be unmuted. So great. Thanks, BK. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for volunteering.
Yes, a round of applause for our volunteers. Thank you so much. And we are ready to go. Guten Tag, guten Tag, guten Tag, guten Tag, alle. Guten Tag.
Guten Tag.
Tag.
Guten Tag.
Alle, guten Tag.
Tag. Guten Tag.
Guten Tag.
Sehr gut, sehr gut. Zuhören, zuhören. Was ist heute das Thema? Was ist heute das Thema? Das Thema heute ist der Wasserzyklus. Der Wasserzyklus. Der Wasserzyklus. Alle, der Wasserzyklus.
Der Wasserzyklus.
Sehr gut, der Wasserzyklus. Das Thema heute ist der Wasserzyklus. Das Wasser, das Wasser, das Wasser. Alle, das Wasser.
Das Wasser.
Das Wasser.
Das Wasser.
Sehr gut.
Wasser.
Der Zyklus. Der Zyklus. Alle?
Der Zyklus. Der
Der
Zyklus.
Zyklus. Sehr gut, sehr gut. Und das macht der Wasserzyklus. Der Wasserzyklus. Alle?
Der Wasserzyklus.
Sehr gut, sehr gut. Was ist heute das Thema? Das Thema heute ist
Der Wasserzyklus.
der Wasserzyklus. Alle?
Der
Der
Wasserzyklus.
Wasserzyklus.
Sehr gut, sehr gut. Der Wasserzyklus, das ist die Sonne. Die Sonne. Alle? Die Sonne.
Die Sonne.
Die Sonne.
Die Sonne.
Die Sonne.
Die Sonne. Alle?
Sonne.
Die Sonne.
Sonne.
Das ist die Sonne. Und die Wolke. Alle? Die Wolke. Die Wolke.
Die Wolke.
Die Wolke. Sehr gut.
Wolke.
Zuhören, zuhören. Die Sonne ist im Himmel. Ja, die Sonne ist im Himmel und die Wolke ist im Himmel. Ja,
Ja.
die Sonne ist im Himmel und die Wolke ist im Himmel. Sehr gut. Und die Kälte, die Kälte, die Kälte. Alle? Die Kälte.
Die Kälte.
Kälte.
Kälte. Sehr gut.
Kälte.
Kälte. Und die Wärme, die Wärme, die Wärme. Alle?
Die Wärme. Die Wärme.
Die Wärme.
Sehr gut. Alle, die Kälte,
Die Kälte.
die Wärme.
Die
Die
Wärme.
Wärme.
Sehr gut, sehr gut. Das Wasser, alle, das Wasser.
Das Wasser.
Das Wasser.
Sehr gut. Und der Dampf, der Dampf, der Dampf. Alle.
Der Dampf.
Der Dampf. Der Dampf.
Sehr gut, der Dampf.
Der Dampf.
Sehr gut. Und der Regen.
Der Regen.
Sehr gut. Alle, der
Der
Regen.
Regen.
Der Regen.
Regen.
Und der Fluss. Der Fluss.
Der Fluss.
Der Fluss.
Der Fluss.
Sehr gut, sehr gut. Und jetzt beginnen wir. Das Thema heute ist der Wasserzyklus. Alle?
Der
Wasserzyklus.
Fluss.
Sehr gut. Zuhören, zuhören. Das Thema heute ist der Wasserzyklus. Der Wasserzyklus ist ein zyklischer Prozess. Ein zyklischer Prozess. Der Wasserzyklus ist ein zyklischer Prozess. Und der Wasserzyklus hat 4 Phasen. 1, 2, 3, 4 Phasen. Der Wasserzyklus hat 4 Phasen. Der Wasserzyklus ist ein zyklischer Prozess und hat 4 Phasen. Die erste Phase ist die Verdampfung. Die Verdampfung. Die Verdampfung. Alle? Die
Verdampfen.
Sehr gut.
Die
Die,
Verdampfung.
alle zuhören? Die Verdampfung.
Die
Die
Verdampfung.
Verdampfen.
Sehr gut, die Verdampfung. Das ist die erste Phase. Ja, die erste Phase ist die Verdampfung. Die zweite Phase ist die Kondensation. Die Kondensation. Die Kondensation. Alle?
Die
Die Kondensation.
Sehr gut. Die erste Phase ist alle? Die Verdampfung. Alle? Die Verdampfung. Und die zweite Phase? Die
Kondensation.
Kondensation.
Sehr gut. Und die dritte Phase ist der Niederschlag. Der Niederschlag. Der Niederschlag. Alle?
Der Niederschlag.
Der Niederschlag.
Niederschlag.
Sehr gut. Und die vierte Phase ist der Abfluss. Der Abfluss. Der Abfluss. Alle?
Der Abfluss.
Sehr gut, sehr gut.
Der Abfluss.
Der Abfluss, sehr gut. Das Thema heute ist der Wasserzyklus. Das ist ein zyklischer Prozess und das hat 4 Phasen. Jetzt die erste Phase. Die erste Phase ist die Verdampfung. Alle? Die
Verdampfung.
Sehr gut. Zuhören, zuhören. Die erste Phase ist die Verdampfung. Das beginnt mit der Sonne. Ja? Die Sonne ist im Himmel. Die Sonne produziert die Wärme. Ja? Die Sonne produziert die Wärme. Ja?
Ja.
Und die Wärme trifft das Wasser auf den Boden und da wird Dampf produziert. Dampf produziert. Ja? Gut. Die Sonne produziert die Wärme. Die Wärme trifft das Wasser auf den Boden und da wird Dampf produziert. Alle Dampf.
Dampf.
Sehr
Dampf.
gut. Alle Dampf.
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 Das ist die erste Phase, die Verdampfung. Und jetzt die zweite Phase. Die zweite Phase ist die Kondensation. Alle?
Die
Die
Kondensation.
Kondensation.
Sehr gut, die Kondensation. Die Kondensation beginnt mit dem Dampf. Ja? Der Dampf geht hoch auf den Himmel und da wird die Wolke produziert. Die Wolke produziert. Wolke produziert. Alle die Wolke.
Die Wolke.
Die Wolke.
Sehr gut, die Wolke. Sehr, sehr gut. Die Kondensation ist die zweite Phase. Das beginnt mit dem Dampf. Der Dampf geht hoch auf den Himmel. Da wird die Wolke produziert. Und das ist die zweite Phase. Jetzt werden wir das wiederholen. Einmal. Das Thema heute ist der Wasserzyklus. Der Wasserzyklus ist ein zyklischer Prozess mit 4 Phasen. Die erste Phase ist die Verdampfung. Das beginnt mit was?
Sonne.
Die Sonne.
Die Sonne, sehr gut. Die Sonne produziert was?
Die
Wärme.
Wärme.
Sehr gut. Die Sonne produziert die Wärme, alle die Wärme.
Die
Die
Wärme.
Wärme.
Sehr gut. Die Wärme trifft das Wasser auf den Boden und da wird was produziert? Alle?
Die Wärmung oder der Dampf?
Der Dampf.
Der Dampf.
Die Wärme trifft das Wasser und da wird Dampf produziert. Sehr gut. Und das ist die erste Phase. Die zweite Phase ist die Kondensation. Das beginnt mit was?
Der Dampf.
Der Dampf, ja. Der Dampf geht hoch und was wird produziert?
Die Wolke.
Die Wolke. Die Wolke wird produziert. Alle die Wolke.
Die
Die
Wolke.
Wolke.
Sehr gut. Die Wolke ist voll und dick mit dem Wasser. Ja? Die Wolke ist voll und dick mit dem Wasser. Und das ist die zweite Phase, die Kondensation. Puh. Jetzt machen wir eine Pause, eine kleine Pause. Wir haben die Frage Nummer 1. Was ist heute das Thema? Die Sonne, der Wasserzyklus oder die Phasen? Was ist heute das Thema? Alle?
Der Wasserzyklus.
Ja, alle?
Der Wasserzyklus.
Ja, das Thema heute ist der Wasserzyklus. Alle? Der
Der
Wasserzyklus.
Wasserzyklus.
Alle, bitte, alle?
Der
Der Wasserzyklus.
Sehr gut. Lauter, bitte, lauter.
Der
Der
Wasserzyklus.
Wasserzyklus.
Sehr gut, sehr gut.
Wasserzyklus.
Frage Nummer 2. Wie viele Phasen hat der Wasserzyklus? 1, 2, 3 oder 4? Wie viele Phasen hat der Wasserzyklus? 1, 2, 3 oder 4? Alle?
4.
1,
4.
4 Phasen. 4 Phasen, ja? Die Verdampfung, die Kondensation, der Niederschlag und der Abfluss, das macht 4 Phasen. Ja? Wie viele Phasen hat der Wasserzyklus? Alle?
4
4. Sehr gut.
Phasen.
4 Phasen. Sehr, sehr gut. Ausgezeichnet. Nummer 3. Was wird durch die Sonne produziert? Was wird durch die Sonne produziert? Die Wärme oder die Kälte? Die Wärme oder die Kälte? Alle?
Die
Die
Wärme.
Wärme.
Sehr gut. Lauter bitte. Und alle?
Die Wärme.
Die Wärme. Sehr gut. Was wird durch die Sonne produziert? Alle?
Die Wärme.
Die Wärme.
Sehr gut. Ausgezeichnet. Die Wärme. Und was wird durch die Verdampfung produziert? Das Wasser, der Dampf oder die Kälte? Was wird durch die Verdampfung produziert? Das Wasser, der Dampf oder die Kälte? Alle?
Der Dampf.
Dampf.
Der Dampf. Der Dampf. Alle lauter bitte, alle?
Der
Dampf. Sehr gut. Was wird durch die Verdampfung produziert, alle?
Der Dampf.
Dampf.
Der Dampf. Sehr gut, ausgezeichnet. Und die letzte Frage. Was wird durch die Kondensation produziert? Der Dampf oder die Wolke? Was wird durch die Kondensation produziert? Der Dampf oder die Wolke? Alle?
Die Wolke.
Die Wolke. Sehr gut. Alle lauter bitte. Die Wolke.
Die Wolke.
Sehr gut, sehr gut.
Wolke.
Was wird durch die Kondensation produziert, alle?
Die Wolke.
Die Wolke. Ausgezeichnet. Sehr, sehr gut. Whew. We first want to give a huge round of applause for our volunteers, each and every one of you who so actively participated. And then to all of you out there behind your muted microphones who I'm sure were also actively participating. Thank you so much for that. We're going to do a quick poll now so that you can assess a little bit about the lesson and your experience of it, okay? So you're going to have two questions in your poll real quick. The first question is about how much of the lesson were you able to understand over the course of that lesson? And then about what percentage of the vocabulary from the lesson could you translate from German into English, assuming you had that graphic organizer in front of you, right? If you had that graphic organizer, about how much could you translate based on this lesson? So you should have the poll in front of you now. Take a moment, just give your gut instinct and response.
Okay, we'll do a few more seconds here.
Yeah, thank you to everybody for your responses. We've got about 2/3 of you that have responded and there's still a few more.
Okay, it looks like it's slowing down. Last chance, everybody. All right, here we go.
All right, so good. I think about 3/4 of you were able to respond. So we're going to look at these results. So the first question was about how much of it you understood, just passive understanding, what we call, of course, receptive skills from viewing and listening. And amazingly, over a third of you were able to understand 100% of that lesson. Now, maybe a third of you are fluent in German, but I'm guessing that's probably not the case. So that's a pretty good outcome. We can imagine, since we're learning content in German that is, academic content. Then another 23% understood most of, 20% half, 15% a third, and then a small number of you less than 20% or not at all. So assuming that most of us in this room, in this session, don't really know much German at all, these are pretty good outcomes, right? For a 10-minute lesson on an academic content concept. When we look at the second question, it's about the percentage of the vocabulary you could translate from German into English. So it's a little more of a productive skill, right? You would have to be able to produce the words. And we can see that the 100% is a little lower, right? That 75% is about the same as it was for the listening. And then the rest is lower, right? And it's not surprising. I like to break these skills up into the receptive skills of understanding versus the productive skill of actively translating, because we know that typically language learners can understand a little more than we can produce, okay? So, so that's interesting information for us, and it's a good reminder to us that receptive skills, listening and reading, are a little bit more accessible to most of us than our productive skills, speaking and writing. But both areas of skills are both productive and receptive skills. You guys really demonstrated a pretty high level on this lesson in German, even though it was super quick. And most of us probably don't have German knowledge. So that's a really great bunch of results. Thank you so much for that. We're going to close out of those. And then we're going to move into a Chatterstorm discussion. So I think by now, probably our volunteers, let's give them a round of digital applause. Go ahead and use I think there's an applause button. Let's give them all a big round of applause.
Oh, I don't know if we have that. If we don't, we need to get it.
High five. Yeah, you guys
thank you, Kim. Applause. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you so much. You're raising your hands in a high five. That'll work just as well. So Everybody's giving a high five. Thank you, thank you. It takes a lot. First of all, of course, it takes some courage, right, to put ourselves out there and to say these strange words in a language that we don't really understand. So thank you for being vulnerable and willing to do that. So what we're going to do first is let you ponder for a moment and think about the teacher techniques. I've put here on the slide that basic graphic organizer that I had up. Think about the teacher techniques that I, as the German instructor, used to make this content comprehensible for you. So think mostly what was provided for you. What did I do as a teacher that was helpful, both visually, but also anything else I did, and enter that into the chat. We'll let those go through. I know Liz is going to help me with the chat a little bit.
Absolutely. You see a lot of pictures, gesturing, total physical response, repetition, lots of repetition, lots of visual support, labeled diagrams, pointing, modeling, having the text, again, repetition, the diagrams, those going back to those visuals, pausing to summarize and check for understanding. Again, pictures simultaneous with the gestures is very helpful. Another mention for the quick check and the pause to the processing time, right? Clarify the pronunciation of words, slower speech.
Wonderful. I love it.
I love this. The sort of no opt-out strategy that you used. That struck one of our attendees. Constant repetition. I noticed that as well as I was over here participating at home, and I'm sitting here in my office speaking German and my dog is looking at me very confused, but I noticed the repetition was very, very helpful. Absolutely.
Yes, you know, I'm glad you noticed all of that, because sometimes we underestimate how many repetitions it takes, right? I would say when I'm observing instruction, we often err because we're concerned about time, right? Which is very viable and understandable, right? We need to be moving forward in a lesson, that we might shortcut on the repetition. But as you'll notice, the repetition slowed us down a little, but it also enabled us to internalize much more quickly. So although it slows the flow of our lesson a bit, we won't have to go back and reteach nearly as much, because we quickly internalize through the repetition. And then as most of you mentioned also, the simultaneous movement, visual, word, and then oral repetition, right? So all of those things together, doing them all simultaneously and repeatedly, really seems to work to cement this new language deeply into our brains. And what I sometimes do, if I do a lesson like this in a longer training, at the end of the day, my exit ticket is for people to have to just do one of the words or more from the German lesson. And even if we haven't done it for 6 or 8 hours, people are really astounded that they remember. Many will remember one word, but most will remember many words from it, especially if they had used those gestures. So thank you for all of that. Are there any other chat comments that you want to share, Liz?
Yes, Donna just mentioned that she really liked the either or question. So when you did those quick checks, you provided options, and that was helpful for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, so this whole lesson obviously is designed with the assumption that that everyone is a beginner or a near beginner in German. And so that scaffold on that check for understanding or little mini quiz to give options and choices is really a helpful option so that you can begin to assess early. I do get often asked, well, how can I assess them so early on? How can I expect them to know all of this? And so simply offering choices is definitely a useful strategy. Anything else, Liz?
Oh, absolutely. The feedback keeps coming in, which is great. Consistent feedback, constant feedback. As well, we have a few attendees mentioning cognates and also having a strong foundation in another language, which comes in handy for being able to recognize some of those words, some of those cognates.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. We're going to come back to the cognates because that moves into the learner strategies, which is going to be a great conversation as well. But before we do that, I want to just kind of go through a few of the scaffolds that were provided. I like to think about, if we look at the image of the language learner in the lower right-hand corner, this student is immersed, immersed in the language of instruction. But look that the student is fully immersed, but also looks to be really enjoying it, right? This is a pleasant experience. And I hope that in that German lesson, you found it challenging, but also somewhat enjoyable, right? There's a certain energy, there's a certain sort of element of satisfaction and surprise that you can actually be successful from the start. So I like to kind of think about that and think about all of the scaffolds that we as teachers provide as, these things like a life preserver, a life ring, goggles, or, fins, all of these things that help make that immersion more comfortable. And so what that specifically looks like in terms of teacher techniques, as many of you mentioned, would be things like slow, clear speech. But you'll notice, maybe you noticed, I got faster. I started slow, but I sped up because I repeated enough times and you had all of those other scaffolds. I could speed up and I could even change the grammar a bit, which you may or may not have had the opportunity to really observe, but I just want to point that out. The gestures, of course, and the repetition. I repeat to model a lot, and then I also have you all repeat a lot. The pictures coupled with the words, and I know someone actually talked about pointing. I find it actually critical to point to what we're talking about, to direct the eyes of the students at the picture and words together, because it can be super overwhelming, right? So we don't want it to be overwhelming at first. We want the students to readily be able to see what I'm talking about as the teacher, what I'm referring to, what the word looks like, what it sounds like. So there's actually a strategy for that. Strangely enough, it's very simple. It's called point and say. I always tell teachers, if you did nothing different in your instruction, but add in pointing to whatever it is you're referring to as you say it, you probably are going to capture and hold, a huge number of your students who otherwise might be totally lost. So point and say, don't underestimate. I'm all about the easy solutions that are high yield. Also, color coding. Often color coding of the language is helpful if it can reflect the meaning of the words. The graphic organizer itself, many will point out as being helpful. I think some of you called it a diagram, which is great as well. And then encouragement. I think it's really, I hope that you felt comfortable and encouraged, usually just by kind of laughing and giving feedback that just allows multiple at-bats, right? That's a baseball analogy. I know not all of us are from the US, but multiple times at bat with it. And just keep trying and keep listening to the modeled language and keep trying. You're going to get a much better pronunciation just purely by doing that a few times. And that's a safe space to develop and create for your students. So I'm going to pause there. And Liz, is there anything in the chat that we might want to touch upon?
Yes, ma'am. I was just getting ready to interject. There is a handout that's coming in a few minutes, so stay tuned for that. And then a couple of people are asking, will the recording go out? Yes, tomorrow we will send out the recording of today's session. And then a question came in as you were talking about these teacher techniques, which I think is a good discussion piece. So when we're talking about gestures, repetition, pointing, and that sort of thing, I believe it was, yes, Heather mentioned, doing this all day, every day, does it get frustrating? She can see if you, I'm just, forgive me, Heather, I'm sort of assuming here that if you, she might be concerned that if you do too much of this, that it loses its effectiveness because it gets overwhelming or gets frustrating. Or any thoughts on that in terms of pacing yourself and how much of this you want to do without, overwhelming?
Great question. So yes, it can become exhausting for the teacher and for the students. So it's actually, let me see how I want to put this. So if we were to only lecture for a full 50 minutes or whatever amount of time, then we can see how this would become tiresome for the teacher and for the students. So first of all, doing this in short bursts, short sort of intensive mini lessons, kind of like what we just did, and then and then moving into some other ways to process the material that are less, teacher directed and also less sort of performative, I guess you could say. That's the most effective way. It's not that we would not provide these scaffolds, but we just don't want to be doing this all day long. So that would be my first recommendation. So maybe after what we just did, if this was a longer session, is that I would give you the opportunity to work with a partner to complete a graphic organizer, right? And then to practice presenting it to one another. So therefore it's different for them. Or they could also read a short text, and then highlight the parts of the text that explain different parts of the graphic organizer, and maybe label, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. So we could see how we can continue the work. It's not that we just do this all day, every day. The other thing I would say is, like all scaffolds, you pull them away. Okay, you don't leave them there forever. So if we revisited this lesson and built on it tomorrow, then I would be starting already to remove some of the arrows, for example, right? Because by now you should know enough to know where to find the information. Also, the repetition would be much less as we move forward. Maybe we're going to focus on the first, the Verdampfung phase, but we're going to break it down much more. So we're not going to scaffold super heavily for stuff we've already done, but we're going to be scaffolding for the new information. So always increasing the challenge and having the expectation that what we've learned so far is sticking, right? It's sticking in our brains. That helps it to keep it fresh and to keep it new.
Great response to a great question. And one more came in, and this is from Eileen, and it actually connects to a couple of questions that came in earlier about such great visuals being key. And people notice you have great visuals in your slides that are very helpful. So the question comes in around time to prepare something like this, and knowing that we have to include these visuals, how do we make it manageable so that we're able to prepare and get all of these things in there that we know are great scaffolds for the students?
Great question as well. So for me, always when I think about prep for language learners, I always think we have to spend our time on the right things. So I prioritize visuals in my preparation, because the amount of, the impact and power of those visuals saves so much time in terms of explaining and re-explaining. They're just so powerful. I just go on and use the visuals I can find that are in public domain. So I don't have anything fancy to pull from. And I just figure out the most powerful images. I think it's worth the time. I would say that you can use those same visuals over and over for different things. And you also, in your planning, like I said, you're only going to do about 10 minutes of this type of presentation. And then you're going to set them up to do some application activities where they're still using the same visuals. So I think I would just say that you are strategic in the use of those visuals. And then you have aligned application activities. So you don't have to, it's not like you're creating visuals for 6 hours a day.
Great answer again to a great question. And if I could just mention something I see a lot of on Facebook, especially in newcomer groups or ELL groups where teachers sort of convene to share ideas. Oftentimes, it's very common to see teachers posting in those groups, hey, I'm doing a lesson on the water cycle, looking for great visuals, looking for any materials that anybody has that they're willing to share, and just sort of reaching out and seeing if anybody out there has something to share and pooling resources that way. That's another way to go to hopefully cut down on some of the time it would take to prepare these. But as BK said, the time spent preparing these, it's time well spent, and it's investing on the front end to make sure that students are picking up the language, as challenging as it is.
Yeah, because that graphic organizer of the water cycle is something I would use for the entire unit. We would come back to it. And use it to anchor the more detailed information that we'd be learning about each of the each of the phases. So yeah, but also collaboration for sure, like Liz said, to get those together. So now, if it's all right, we're going to move into the learner strategies, the strategies that you used to understand and actively participate in the lesson. And these may be physical behaviors, what were you attending to, but also what was going on inside your brain, right? That sort of metacognitive piece. So go ahead and start entering strategies that you used. And no strategy could be too small or silly, okay? Anything you noticed that you were using to make sense of this lesson and be an active participant.
I'm seeing a lot of prior knowledge pop up.
Mm-hmm.
Prior knowledge, cognates, using Google Translate on my phone, listening carefully, listening for words that I recognized in English and Spanish, relating the sound to the prints, writing down keywords, listening for content words, trying to make connections with words I already know, using the visuals, relying on those visuals again. Again, another shout out to connecting to prior knowledge. I know I found myself doing that quite a bit as well. So yeah, focusing on the visuals, the gestures, connecting those to the words, and then connecting all of that to any language or second language that some of our attendees already have. Somebody was tapping into that German she learned in middle school to help out with that understanding. And again, heavy reliance on the visuals and the text.
Thank you for that. So often it's pretty fun. People will notice that they relied on maybe the German they learned in middle school, as our one attendee noted, or as someone else noted, connecting it to the English and the Spanish that they know, or whatever other languages. So this is, I think, really helpful for us all to remember that any language that we have, any language experience, any knowledge of languages from any time in our lifetime can start to get activated through something like this, right? Because what happens is that our brains are starting to try to make sense of something, and they're looking for any and every pattern that will help make sense of it. This is, I think, super important to remember as language teachers, because sometimes there are many people that don't really understand language acquisition that will feel like other languages are an inhibitor to learning, let's just say English, or that they are a barrier, or that they somehow get in the way, right? Oh gosh, or that there's confusion, like when a language learner is referring to other languages and what they know in those languages, that they're somehow confused. But in fact, language learning, this is how language learning occurs, because the brain is looking for the commonalities, the similarities and the differences between any languages they've ever learned in order to seek out the patterns and to learn new languages. So I just like to emphasize that, because I think it's hopefully many of us experienced a little bit of that here, and we'll take that back into our practice as teachers to really understand that those connections to our other language or languages are critical tools for our students to learn the new language.
Having that bilingual brain is a blessing. That's right, Sarah.
Yes, it's a blessing, not a curse.
Yes.
Awesome. I also think some people are surprised that there are cognates. In other words, those similar words. They're words that are rooted in the same history. And some people are surprised that those words exist between German and English. But, we have water, Wasser, Phasen, Phase, produziert, produce, zyklischer Prozess, cyclical process, right? There's quite a few. So it's kind of fun to point those out and to see how those launch us forward into our new learning of the new language. Anything else, Liz?
It looks like it's slowing down in the chat. People are celebrating their bilingual or trilingualism in some cases. So it's a positive feeling right now in the chat area. Oh, we just had one more question come in. What kinds of additional activities do you recommend to build schema for students who may not have the prior knowledge? So for example, if you were going to teach this lesson to students who are learning the water cycle for the first time.
Yeah. So so in this really rapid lesson, we definitely depended on the fact that I assumed people had some knowledge already, right? And that we were going to be deepening that knowledge. But it is possible that students might not know about the water cycle at all, let's just say. But you'll notice, so in the warm up that we did here, we did the vocabulary preview, right? Of the sun and the rain and the heat and the heat and the cold and all of that. So that was we could instead connect it more to their actual experiences with weather, right? So always thinking about your students and what they do bring, because they do bring knowledge, they just may not know yet that it's the water cycle. So another thing another way to use visuals that I think is super powerful is to just have a great photograph, or to ask your students to bring a photograph of their favorite weather. Like you could just tell them, in 2 weeks, we're gonna be studying the water cycle or the weather. And so over the next 2 weeks, take some photographs. If they have a phone, a lot of our students have phones, right? Take some photographs of just like the way the weather is. And then you get to submit one to share with the class. I like to leverage as much as possible what the students actually bring as the visuals. So if you're anticipating a new lesson, you can invite that as almost like a pre-engagement homework assignment. Not everyone will do it, and that's okay, because you don't need 20, 30, 40, or 50 photographs. You really only need a couple, or one for that matter. And you can always have one in your own stash, but it really works great to let the students generate that. And then from there, you can build, well, why is it that it rains? And what happens to the water when it falls? And, then you can move in from that angle.
Do you have any suggestion for involving students in participation outside of what you already shared with the repeating and that sort of thing? We have Wendy asking if you have any just general recommendations for student participation, and she says she's doing more grammar with them at this time. But
yeah, so for participation, I mean, obviously this choral response is very helpful for just getting everyone activated and getting people to use language where they otherwise might be shy. And a lot of people say, well, that's good for little kids, but older kids won't do it. Older kids will definitely do it. It's more of a habit that needs to be formed. Older kids will do the repetition. Beyond the repetition, like to me, the repetition is really just getting the wheels turning, getting everyone feeling comfortable, getting their mouths used to making these words, getting them introduced to this vocabulary. But they're going to need to have opportunities in either with a partner or in small groups to continue to practice. So I would have them work with this same graphic organizer. You could do a dialogue. You could have dialogue frames where they ask each other questions and answers, especially if their language level is not that advanced. So you could have dialogue frames to ask and answer questions around the content using the graphic organizer as their support. You could have them complete the graphic organizer. You could have them work in groups where each group is going to orally present their phase, right? So you've got 4 groups, or they could write a chapter in the book, or they could make a picture book for children. That each, that follows the 4 phases, and each group is responsible for one of the phases. I'm just throwing out a bunch of ideas here.
no, that's great. We have so many questions coming in, and we've sort of inadvertently moved into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I have about 5 questions actually waiting in the Q&A box to get to. But I just wanted to let our attendees know that, yes, I see them. And yes, we are definitely going to get to them. But I wanted to give BK a couple more minutes to kind of finish up her presentation.
Let me finish up, if you don't mind, the learner strategy piece real quick. And then yes, the questions will be great. So the learner strategies part, first of all, I really like to think about this as a partnership. We as language teachers, it's exhausting for us, right? We're putting all the work in, and a lot of times we put all the work in and literally only a half of the class, or maybe even only a quarter, actually takes advantage of all that we are doing for them. So in your handout, and you can share the handout if you would like now.
Perfect. Thank you. I was just going to ask that. We'll put a
Yeah.
link to the handout in the chat for everybody so you can reference that. Give us one moment. We'll drop that link momentarily.
Awesome. So in the handout, you're going to see a T-chart, and on the left-hand side are the teacher techniques that we've already kind of talked about, and there's way more than what we talked about. It's packed. And then on the right side of that T-chart are the learner strategies. I like to share it that way as a T-chart because it's so simple, but also you can work with your students on this type of an activity in order to basically create what I would consider almost like a little agreement, right? You're saying, look, I, on my end, am breaking my back with all, with everything I'm doing, making this information visually interesting, easy for you to, all that stuff, all the teacher techniques we talked about. Now, your job is to take advantage of those things, right? So you're going to look and listen and repeat and move. You're going to track the speaker, and this tracking piece, the second bullet here, a lot of students will not automatically pick up on the fact that they need to not just listen or not just look, but they need to be able to track, right? Tracking, I define as looking at what the teacher's saying, looking at the picture, looking at the word, looking at the movement, listening to all of that, reading the word, right? All of that, that's a lot. I mean, when you think about it, pointing out what that all means and helping students see the value of all of that and helping them almost define their own way of tracking. Because some of us depend mostly on pictures. Others of us, if we were to canvas this whole room, might say, the picture's okay, but I really look at that word because the word, so that's kind of a learning style type of situation, right? So it's really helpful for us to explicitly explain to the students and let them experience all of these different learner strategies so they can be active learners and they can be strategic, right? They can figure out what works best for them. Also connecting to the background knowledge, personal as well as content knowledge, connecting to their additional languages, and then also just perseverance, right? Just that this will be productive struggle. We are it's not passive learning like this. So you've got to be able to take risks, make mistakes, laugh, keep going, encourage one another, students, as well as the teacher with the students. So all of those are ways to keep students engaged. Critical, however, is that we remember we can't then do this for an hour at a time, right? Or even 50 minutes. We have got to chunk this, get the full buy-in, and then set the students off to be doing other application activities so that they can start to apply what they're learning using different modalities. So I will pause and stop there. Liz, are there questions or comments?
I just wanted to let everybody know that the link to the handout that BK was referring to, it has posted in the chat, and it's a nice 2-column chart with some information obviously tied to what we've been doing today. So you have it all nice in one place, sort of what the language teacher does versus a language learner. Very great resource. It's linked there in the chat for you. Let me
add one thing, because I know sometimes when we see something like that, we're like, oh my gosh, am I going to teach all of that to my students at once? And of course, the answer is no. Those are all different strategies that you as a teacher will be trying out and then that your students will be using. And you can just add, I suggest posting that T-chart if you're going to do it this way in your classroom, and then adding to it, right? Asking the students, what was helpful to you that I did during this lesson? And then adding it, over time to that left side of the T-chart, and then asking them, to reflect upon their own learning, what was helpful to them, and adding that to the T-chart. So it's much more sort of organic, growing out of their experiences over time. And that way they own it and it's not overwhelming.
Thank you so much. Now I want to have some time to get to the questions. We have about 7 or so minutes left. So are we ready for questions?
We are.
All right, great. Let's just go ahead and jump right in because there are a lot of, I think, burning questions. One just came in from Donna, and it's about disengagement right now with students who are learning virtually. So I just was wondering if there's something that you're hearing out there in your work with districts for techniques and things for kids who aren't turning on their cameras, or they don't answer when prompted, or they're having internet issues. I mean, this is just the reality of what's going on, and there are no simple, easy answers. However, I just figured maybe you could share what a few people what you've learned out there working with districts.
I definitely will concur with everyone's struggles in that area. And it's particularly challenging with language learners because interacting through active participation and use of language is what will help them learn. But yet in this virtual world, they may be the most likely to not do that. And then it kind of spirals, right? It's almost like a spiral for them, which is more detrimental than it would be for a native English speaker. You know, it's still not good for the native English speakers, but there's a whole other level for our language learners. I have found a lot of the teachers I'm working with do find this whole choral piece very community building. Even with older kids, you know, that it's just more community building, because a lot of the challenge we're having, of course, is just feeling connected and feeling connected with little squares on the screen. And, you know, it's very sort of disembodied. So the choral piece helps. I mean, of course, the small groups help, except that if students aren't speaking, they aren't speaking, you know, or if they're not participating, they're not participating. Usually for me, at this point, the other thing that I am hearing everyone talking about that's working is looking for ways for the students to be able to interact around things that are relevant to them. So any way that we can tie our content to their experiences in their family and in their community, that's always important, but now it's even more critical just to get them to engage.
Absolutely. We have, let me go here to the Q&A. We had a question come in around what can be done to promote learner strategies of students without pushing them too hard. So how can we help struggling students to develop those strategies without pushing too hard? Like, how do you know when to pull back? What should I look for there?
Mm-hmm. So the fallback for kids who are really not I mean, first of all, you have to, of course, know your students, and because some students start out hesitant due to, you know, what we call the silent phase, or just general not having confidence and not having enough to even say, but that can turn into just sort of perpetual silence, right? So there's always that tension, that little bit of tension where you want to be pushing the students, but not pushing them to the point of frustration or embarrassment, for for sure. So usually the more scaffolds and rehearsal, like I usually if you're doing choral, that's one rehearsal opportunity, having them rehearse things. And rehearsal is a very sort of broad term for just practice in safe places, right? So one safe place is choral, another safe place is with a peer that they are comfortable with, where they can sort of listen a lot and then be encouraged to speak a little. Those are two rehearsal, and then even small groups. So if do you guys know the numbered heads Kagan strategy? Mm-hmm. So you let the group rehearse, and you provide some scaffolds so they're ready to go, and then you randomly select someone to share. And for a student that's very hesitant, you can, of course, start with them only answering one word. I mean, if that's what it's going to take at the beginning, that's fine. And then over time, you just work toward, sentences, etc. I'm not sure if I'm getting to answer the question, but that's how I understood it.
No, I think that's great. That's perfect. I do want to get to this question, and this question actually may be better. It may be better for this attendee to email you to get more information, but I thought it was an interesting question. They wanted to know, in your experience, this person's looking for advice as to next steps in fighting for English learners in his or her state to earn high school credits or exempt end of course testing requirements like is done in other states. So it's more of an advocacy question. how to navigate that landscape of advocating for potentially some policy changes statewide that would benefit English learners, which is not exactly our topic today, but for sure it's related. So I didn't know if that was something that you would like to speak to now, or if you just wanted to provide your contact information for attendees who have questions around policy like that.
Absolutely. So absolutely feel free to contact me. My email is there, whether it's about policy, practice, or anything else. I'm very excited if I would hear from any of you. Policy goes from state to state. It varies from state to state. I think that's definitely something that's probably easier to talk about more specifically depending on your state. Because in some states, there's just so many different avenues depending on if you're a union state or a non-union state, and if you have actual statute that, or whether you're only going in compliance with federal statute, which is a lot of what states do. So that being said, yeah, contact me directly, and I'll be happy to talk with you more about that.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we have time for this very last one. We're going to squeak it in there just under the deadline. What, if anything, do you have to share in terms of differentiating these approaches that we discussed today for age group? Would you say they're all perfect for K-12, or maybe for my secondary students, I'm doing a little bit more of strategy A versus strategy B? Any thoughts on making that distinction?
Yeah, so it would definitely be different for a secondary in that it's more about degree than it is about what's working and what's not working. Typically older students, so secondary students, if they're schooled, of course, if they're coming from schooling in their home countries, if they have relatively well-developed native language and literacy, they're going to access pretty quickly. They're going to probably be tuning into those cross-linguistic connections and cognates and things like that more readily, especially if you point it out to them. So your repetition could be different, right? In terms of the number of times you need to repeat. They also might have, because they're more mature, right? Of course, well, at least hopefully, they may be able to benefit a lot from a partner, a well-trained partner. As we've got to be careful about how we use our partners, but you know, you may be able to set them in more partner work and even a lot of independent work. I mean, I had a 5th grader who came in from Colombia. She was very literate and very well educated, and she was also very motivated. So she ended up doing a lot of the work on her own, and she loved to read. So she loved to read in English and in Spanish, and to like figure a lot of it out herself. So that is a difference, say, between young children and older, more literate and educated people in general, right? It's a difference in how we acquire language depending on our maturity. But everyone can benefit still from the types of interactive immersion that we just did. And I think also I wanted to address one other thing, which is about grammar. Teaching grammar, so the most effective way to teach grammar is to let it align with the work you're already doing, right? Instead of have like grammar that's being taught sort of in an isolated fashion. And I do see grammar taught in an isolated fashion quite a bit, and it's usually not very interesting or effective. So an example in the German lesson, I don't know if I'll try to explain it super quick. You guys may have noticed that, remember we said the produziert, right? It said die Sonne produziert die Wärme, right? The sun produces heat. But later when I was talking about der Dampf wird produziert, that's actually a passive construction. What is this stuff, Dampf? Vapor is produced, okay? So you didn't really know the grammar of that, and yet you understood it. But if I wanted to focus a grammar lesson, then I would definitely focus on the use of passive like that in German, because it's super common in German. It's super common in any scientific language, right? We use, I don't know if you know that, we use passive voice all the time in science. So it's content area specific, it's language specific, and it's complex grammar, right? And we could do that. We could have started doing that tomorrow. And that's what I think is interesting, because some people want to do a grammar sequence that's sort of based on like, well, first we're going to teach the nouns, and then we're going to memorize verbs, and then right? that's not when we integrate content and language, we don't do the same sequence. We do the sequence of the grammar as it's based in and rooted in the actual learning. So I'm just throwing that out there. It's a whole other training, but nonetheless.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that because there were a couple of comments about grammar. And so I think you addressed them with that comment. So great timing and great instinct as well. So
even spelling, for example, just another, you may have noticed some things about the words. And so there were words, and there was even a letter in there. What letter? I think we had the letter that looks like a B, but it's an S. I don't know if we had that in there, but at any rate, spelling can also be taught that way. It doesn't need to be like a list that's sort of random and out there.
it doesn't have to be an isolated or a discrete skill.
Yeah.
Well, before we sign off for today, of course, I wanted to let everybody know we're going to continue this conversation around content area with ESL next week. We're going to have Jody Nolf joining us, and she's an ESOL coordinator in Palm Beach County, and she's going to share some strategies around supporting secondary content area teachers. So please join us. If you haven't registered already, you can do so at our website, or you will be getting an email prompting you to do so, so we can continue working on this particular topic. And we want to thank BK so much for coming and sharing your expertise. There's a lot of comment in the chat about what a positive experience this was, and everybody is so appreciative. So thank you so very much. Thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your day to join us, and feel free to reach out to BK or to Saddleback. We are Saddleback is on all the social media platforms. BK is on Twitter, and her email address has already been shared with you. So thank you so much to all of you for all of the work that you do every day. And thank you, BK, once again for your time. And we'll see everybody next week. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody. Be well.
Bye.